The scripture today is from Hebrews 10, verses 23 through 26. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching.
I love this encouragement to not neglect the gathering together as some are in the habit of doing. It's actually sort of a fun passage to read, especially if you're feeling a little bit sassy or snarky, because there's a way that you can pause that throws a little shade, right? You can say, look, not neglecting to meet together as some are in the habit of doing. Yeah, if you say it like that, it just feels a little judgy. But of course, those people aren't here, so it doesn't matter. We are in a hybrid situation where both online and in person, we gather together, and both are a valid form of us connecting with one another. So whether it is online or in person, doesn't matter. It is the gathering together that brings us into this connection that we crave. So what's happening when we gather together? Well, I want to propose to you that there might be at least three things that are happening. And depending on sort of how you conceive of our life of faith together, you might prioritize one of these things. So I want to ask you the question today. Is church a supplement, a complement, or an alternative to the everyday life? Okay? I'll walk you through these in a minute. So for those who really feel like church is a complement, it's almost like it dovetails smoothly with the other 6 days of the week. That Sunday and Monday aren't vastly different than one another. They really complement one another. And so on Saturday, you don't have to be in the frame of mind about what the activities of Saturday or Saturday night look like to get ready for Sunday morning, because all 7 days of the week sort of flow together for you. They really complement one another. And so you might actually be watching the news, say on a Tuesday night, and a news story comes up and you think to yourself, oh, we talked about that on Sunday, right? Like they're integrated. And your 7 days of the week flow together, they dovetail pretty nicely. And so what we do at church is really a complement to the rest of your life. I think that's an interesting way of approaching that. There's another way of doing church where it is a supplement, that it's very different in some ways to the rest of your week. And one of the things that it does is it provides something, maybe perspective, maybe a centering, maybe a reminder of what is true, whatever it is, but that without it, it would be lacking from your week. And so I find that people who approach church this way will often say things like, maybe after the service, they'll be like, "Ooh, I really needed that. In fact, I wouldn't mind if we had church more than once a week," right? Because it's supplementing the steady diet of whatever regular life is. There's something missing. And so by what we do here when we gather together, it supplements that and provides what is missing in sort of the everyday existence. Some of you might take a multivitamin, or some of you once in a while, say after Thanksgiving week, will think, I should really eat lettuce, right? Like, you've had too much of one thing and you could use a little bit of the other to offset it, right? And so that's a totally different, in my mind, way to approach this. There's a third way that I find fascinating, and I know it's a minority perspective, but there's a third way of doing it, which is to say that actually what we do when we're together is almost, in some ways, unrelated to all of that other stuff we call normal life, regular life. What this is an alternative way of being in the world that is offset from the affairs of everyday life. And this, in one sense, is more than a vacation from normal life. This is almost like training or a discipline that prepares you for what you're going to encounter out there. And so when people have this perspective on church, they very much view this sacred space as a different kind of space than whatever is happening outside of these walls. And that these songs are different than songs you sing during the week, that this day maybe is the Sabbath, and that it is set apart. And in this sense, one of these days is not like the others. And so this alternative way of being says, when we are here, when we are focused on these things, maybe we're at table together, when we lift up these prayers, when we sing these songs, it is patterning us. It is providing a pattern for us that prepares us for what we have to endure the rest of the week. These three perspectives are very different from one another. When people feel like what we do at church is a complement to their normal life, they can actually flow in and flow out. And it's almost like going to a gas station, right? It's not entirely different. It's just a stopover. You fuel up and you're on your way, right? It's not a crisis, right? It's not a confrontation. It's just integrated, dovetails nicely into what you do in the week. For those who view this as more of a supplement, you really notice it when you assume that what we call normal life out there, that is a certain way. And so we want to make sure that what happens in here is a little different. And so there's an intentionality about our time together to say, right, but in the rest of the week, people X, Y, and Z. So when they're here, right, if you view the world as a rough and tumble place, you might want to say, when we're at church, I want it to be a safe space. I want to make sure that it's predictable, I know what's coming, and that it's going to be comforting, right? And that I leave a little better than I came. So that's a supplement. I want it to be a supplemental thing that happens in my life. And then for the third perspective of the total alternative, it is to say, what happens out there, it's not that it's insignificant, it's that we can't always be reacting to the culture around us. God, or the tradition, has given us the pattern of what we do when we're together, because we cannot live, especially in this culture of constant crisis, we cannot live in reaction to the world all the time, or we're going to be frazzled and discouraged and worn out, and will be no good to the world that is in such need, because we are living like the world. We're responding to them. They're setting the agenda, and we're following them, and we wonder why we're frazzled and worn out and discouraged and depressed. So these three different ways, I think, are pretty significant different approaches to what we do when we are together. I really noticed it in 2016, 2017. It was my first time in almost 20 years where I was not in local church ministry. I had been a pastor at a local church for most of my adult life up to that point. And in 2016, I got a chance to be a professor at a seminary. And so I wasn't required to be at church on Sunday. It was a really interesting year. And so I took the opportunity to visit as many churches in our area as I could. Some I went to because I had heard good things about them. Some I went to because I had never been to that kind of a church before. Some I went to because my students were involved there. And I really noticed how distinct these three approaches were, because I don't know if you remember 2016, but there was a presidential election that year that surprised some people with the way it went, and not everyone was super happy about it. Well, what I witnessed in visiting all of these churches, and I really wish I had kept a log so that I had an exact number of how many I visited. But I can tell you it was quite stark and noticeable to me about which churches preached on the news and which ones preached about the news and which ones completely ignored the news. It was actually pretty profound, because a lot of churches that I went to that had stained glass and where the preacher wore a white robe and all, they preached the news. I mean, honestly, you could have left that morning watching MSNBC or driven to church listening to NPR, gotten out of your car, walked into the sanctuary, and not known you had changed the channel, right? Like, it sounded exactly like what I had been listening to on cable news. And then there were other churches that took what I would call more of a justice or a prophetic bend, where they would say, you probably saw on the news this week X, Y, and Z, right? This really stood out to me. There was one week there was a stabbing on the MAX train. And the minister, she did a great job by addressing, you probably saw on the news this week, but what you didn't see. And then she told us a different story. And so that was a supplement. So she assumed the news, and then she supplemented it with a different perspective. I really appreciated that. I thought it was an interesting way to do it. And then there were a third group of churches where you honestly could be in the worship service, you could be in the sanctuary, and not know anything bad was happening in the world at all. It's like the news didn't exist. We were in this safe bubble. It was fantastic. And you just got basically an hour off of whatever chaos was going on around there. And it was just nice to be together, you could tell, to sing lovely songs that drew your eyes and heart to heaven, and heard a message about the importance of the way we live in the world. And you could honestly go the entire hour and not think about the news at all. It was fascinating. So when I got the honor of being appointed to local church ministry again, I really wanted to be quite intentional about integrating all three of these perspectives. I wanted to make sure that there were some elements of what we did in our time together that fit your week well and dovetailed nicely with the way you lived out faith as a community in this neighborhood. That it was smooth and sort of flawless, and you didn't even have to think about it. It might even be second nature, and that it just all worked together, and there was something really therapeutic and quite comforting about it. But I also know that there was an element where we had to do some supplemental, right? Because the agenda of whatever's happening in the world, whatever we talk about that, real life, is not exactly what God has called us to, or what the life of faith is ultimately possible with. And so if we only let the world set the agenda and we don't supplement it with some alternative stuff when we're together, then really what's the point of getting together at all? If this is just a sanctified version of that, it's a little cleaned up, we had some Bible verses, right? Well, it's basically just a baptized version of the culture. So there has to be something we do when we're together that supplements. But I also wanted to make sure that there was a third thing always happening. Sometimes for some of you, you may not even pick up on it, but underneath the surface, which was just a reminder that our calling is a higher calling, and that what we do here when we're together cannot be determined or dictated by what happens in a week, or we're always playing defense or catch up, and that's a losing game. That what God has called us to by her Spirit is to be a people who follow the beat of a different drum, walk a different way, live a different truth, and form a different life. And that if we just follow this consumer culture of political crisis and economic worry, that's not the life of faith we're called to. And so I've tried, I haven't always done well, but I've tried to balance those three things and to have them all integrated into a gathering when we get together, to make sure that there's something really soothing and comforting that is integrated and therapeutic, that fits in well to your week, that there's something that supplements what's missing in your week, and to remind you that the weeks that are to come can be very different than what the world is offering you for the weeks that have been behind. And that our calling is to a different way of life in the world. So I just wanted to put this in front of you, and I would be interested in having you chat for just a second with each other. If, you know, and obviously you're probably going to say all three. I want it to be right, all three, but I'm going to take that away from you. And I would just like to know, if you had to pick one, I would be curious, if you had to pick one, would you go with the supplement, the complement, or the alternative? Which one sort of appeals to you the most? So I'm just going to ask you real quick. This is only going to take a minute to just turn to somebody beside you, compare notes, and then we're going to take a quick straw poll. For those of you who are on Zoom, go ahead and chat with yourselves, and I want to hear some different perspectives.